Okay, so good question that's come in. This round of questions on back pain. So from Gear Eyes, hi Brian. In my experience with a lot of physios, when dealing with lower back pain, they prescribe the activation of your pelvic floor and transverse abdominis. The McGill method of bracing seems to oppose this practice with the pushing out against the fingers of the abdominals as opposed to clamping down. Could you please speak to the cues used for McGill Co. up in relation to bracing, and if not actively engaging the TVA, is a certain amount of its engagement simply a byproduct of bracing anyway? A huge thank you, Mike. So, first off, what do we mean by TVA? So basically we mean transverse abdominis, which is part of your kind of abdominal wall. And again, it's one of those things that comes up a lot, and again, the research is out there, especially if you're familiar with Stuart McGill's work. He's actually digested the research on this, and we can sort of understand where there's a wee bit of confusion that's come around about this. Not to say that it doesn't contribute, but it doesn't contribute anywhere near as importantly as people believe it does. So, I have to put a script for this because I'm good, but I'm not that good in terms of these technical details and the studies we're going to quote from. So, let's begin with, where does the focus on transverse abdominis come from? So a lot of people will quote a paper by Hodges et al. From 1996 entitled Inefficient Muscular Stabilization of the Lumbar Spine Associated with Lower Back Pain, a Motor Control Evaluation of Transverse Abdominis. And we would suggest that this paper and its conclusions have been misunderstood, especially when you look at the quotes from Hodges himself to kind of counter that effect. So this study was designed to measure the temporal sequence of muscle activation of the TVA, or transverse abdominis, in those with lower back pain. It was not a measure of how much transverse abdominis contributed to spinal stiffness on its own. So basically what they found versus with EMG testing is that the reaction speed or activation of the transverse abdominis was slightly impaired, slightly slower in those with lower back pain than those without. They weren't testing to see how much transverse abdominis contributed to spinal stiffness and core stiffness, just admitted that they observed a measure in which the reaction in some of those people with lower back pain, or with words, some of those people, was slightly lower than in others who didn't have lower back pain. We can also see that Hodges himself claimed in the future this work only demonstrated a potential pathology on the transverse abdominis, and in some of those with lower back pain, and that only perhaps that could contribute to affecting functional performance of core stiffness and spinal stability. We can also look at further work since. If we look at Silfies et al. From 2009, they have a study called Differences in Feedforward Trunk Muscular Activity in Subgroups of Patients with Mechanical Lower Back Pain. Here they've demonstrated that other muscles that contribute to spinal stiffness are also affected in their time of activation, and that you can also define subgroups of different patterns between different patients. So therefore, they all didn't get the same inhibitions to kind of, how muscles are activated. They're all slightly different. So it wasn't just affecting transverse abdominis the same amongst all people. So we can't draw the conclusion that a weak transverse abdominis leads us to, or contributes to lower back pain. We can't also say that all those with lower back pain have issues with their transverse abdominis, because it isn't necessarily true, and certainly the data thus far with these studies hasn't shown that. And again, the Hodges study, a lot of people sort of where this is all kind of come from, even he said that isn't what they were showing. It's kind of been misquoted and misunderstood. So, if we look at Stuart McGill's work, obviously, a lot of people, they like to sort of criticize his work, but 9 times out of 10, they haven't actually looked at his research or looked at his books and actually gone through in depth and understand the amount of depth and consistency and methodical approach has been put into this research. So on page 162 of Low Back Disorders, 3rd edition, we can see a useful graph that demonstrates the influence of individual muscle groups on spinal stiffness during 4 different stabilization exercises. We can see that transverse abdominis only has a small effect on spinal stiffness on its own, or only has a small influence when we try to isolate that muscle in terms of its influence on those particular tasks. But what is more important is how all of those muscles perform together. In fact, through McGill's work and a few others as well, we can see that only the most skilled of those with control of the transverse abdominis are realistically only getting to 1 to 2% of maximum voluntary contraction before the internal obliques and the rest of the abdominal wall are recruited at the same time. So we have a muscle that, not to say it doesn't contribute to spinal stiffness and core stability, it does, but its importance has been far overblown. But also the principle is, it's very hard for all these muscles to just isolate contractions on them on their own without recruiting the other muscles of the abdominal wall at the same time. So what we need to do is see that we, instead of looking at, say, individual muscles and saying that's a particular problem and that's always associated with lower back pain, therefore just that muscle should get stronger, we really need to think of things as skills and understand that there are a lot of muscles that contribute to generate spinal stiffness and core stability. And again, it's very hard to isolate and kind of a waste of time to try and isolate one particular muscle over the others. What we can say though, with different tasks, the priority or the amount a particular component muscle contributes to spinal stiffness can vary. A good example of that is when we do things like bird dogs. So there's a big correlation, and again, the research backed this up, that those with chronic lower back pain issues generally tend to have atrophied or withered away multifidus muscles. Multifidus muscle is a very important muscle in terms of segmental stability to the spine because of how it attaches all the way up and knits those segments together. And one of the particular roles, or one of the tasks that it performs sort of to the best of its abilities, was it's the most recruited on, is when we talk about extension or anti-rotation in extension. So things like bird dogs will cause that muscle to contribute significantly more to core stiffness than certain other muscles that also do at the same time. By sort of heightening that kind of contribution that it makes with that exercise, we can then say that bird dogs and the variations thereof are great tools to rebuild an atrophied multifidus and solve that part or that equation or that part of that person's lower back pain. Because there'll be other things as well, but definitely multifidus is an issue. So again, what we need to do is take a step back, and rather than thinking about targeting just specific muscles or one component, understand that all those components work together. It's just that the degree that which they contribute, each component contributes, varies depending on different tasks. So therefore, again, we can use certain exercises to help sort of focus on one particular component at a time, but at all times they are all working together. So rather than worry about transverse abdominis, we want to think about the bracing skill, which is again how McGill teaches it, with the fingers below, and we sort of fight our fingers. It's a skill, and it's a principle that's that generation of intra-abdominal pressure in that way is the best way that we've got to get all those components to start working together. And that's what we want. We want them to all work together. They all do their fair share of the work, and that gives us the best chance of giving us spinal stiffness and core stability that's going to be actually useful to things that we want to do.